that was it. Just last week I was saying I was looking forward to this week so much because we would finally have a lot to talk about, talking about the Australian Grand Prix, getting into the action, getting into the season, and of course hopefully putting, behind us all these fears of the coronavirus and its outbreak. Unfortunately, here we are in another week and it has been rearing its ugly head, and the latest news is that because of the coronavirus outbreak and the pandemic that's going on right now around the world, is that the Australian Grand Prix has been called off, Nate. So just the reaction and just how we got to here.
Yeah, so it already started on Thursday. There was always a fear with this event going on, and especially over the last couple of weeks, I think the awareness around coronavirus has really ramped up quite a lot, especially in the Western world over the past kind of week or so. There was always a fear of people coming from Europe going to Australia and usually having to fly through certain routes, through Dubai, through Singapore, etc. But one of the fears was actually the teams coming from Italy. That's obviously an area that's really suffering with the amount of cases they have there. But there was always a risk that you put all of these people into one paddock and all it takes is one case and suddenly you have a huge paddock of people who have basically been exposed to it. McLaren tested a staff member who tested positive for coronavirus. McLaren, I think, acted really, really well in that situation. They alerted the media immediately, they alerted people immediately, put the staff member into quarantine, and they pulled out of the race, which I think is a brave thing to do because there's a lot of money riding on these things. And McLaren, we went to the McLaren launch, and they said there on a few occasions, they said, McLaren staff, their safety comes first, and so they've acted in that way. Then the question became, well, does Formula One go ahead with 9 teams? Is it still a championship race if they do that? All sorts of questions. As you say, we now know the race isn't going ahead, but there was such a huge time where we didn't know, and Formula One's communication has been absolutely appalling.
They've left it to the last minute, almost, I would suspect, because of course, just looking at all the sports organizations around the world. I mean, we talk about the NBA, who's just immediately, or the United States just on a whole has basically pulled a plug on all their sporting events right now. England here, there's still some backlash, I suppose, of whether they should do that or not. But of course, football is being played behind closed doors. Champions League reportedly to get postponed as well. And you were wondering, here we are on the eve of what's supposed to be a big weekend for Formula One. And of course, we know that they went into meetings, but it seemed like they took so long to just communicate anything to everybody, right?
Exactly, and I don't think there's any shame in taking a long time to make that decision because there is a lot at stake. But the really shameful thing was just the lack of communication. From the moment McLaren withdrew, we had a completely meaningless statement where F1 said, the safety of everyone is our priority. It basically was a statement that just said absolutely nothing, really. And what it revealed is that there was no plan in place for this happening. There was a lot of talk beforehand. The FIA set up a coronavirus crisis cell, they called it, which was meant to be basically troubleshooting this sort of scenario and saying, if this happened, what would be our response? And the fact that it took so long for F1 to come to any decision, the fact that nobody at F1 was readily available to talk, the FIA wasn't there. I mean, you mentioned the NBA and all these other series. Everybody seemed to have a human face coming forward and actually making this announcement. Formula One might as well not have existed for that time. They weren't saying anything, and I understand it must have been a very difficult decision, and there's a lot going on. But the way it was handled was absolutely appalling, and I actually think it reflects really badly on where F1 is right now. Lewis Hamilton said something really interesting on before this had all happened, before the McLaren team member had been tested and had been diagnosed with coronavirus. He said he couldn't believe that we were still racing, and at that time we were. And he said, "Cash is king." Now you can say what you want about, you might argue that Lewis is a very wealthy man himself.
Yes.
But I think that's a very, very interesting way of looking at it, and it's a shame that it seems that Formula One has followed that instead of doing the right thing as quickly as it should have done. And
it kind of just shows that that gap, I suppose, that you said, that even when you see the drivers seeming a bit like in the dark. I think I had seen something about, Sebastian Vettel. He was speaking about that if it does get this bad, we might be faced with a circumstance where the drivers themselves might refuse to even go out there and race, and we've seen it with Lewis, and just following him on social media. I mean, he's just even put stuff up on his story, and he put literally, "Do not even feel like leaving my hotel room," and rightfully so, because I think all of us feel like that to a certain extent, and when you're seeing someone as big as, like you said, Lewis Hamilton and the drivers just seeming a bit confused and not, almost, it looks like their fears are not being met with the kind of, concern that you would expect from the governing body of your sport, and it just shows that gap that just makes us question. I mean, we're all questioning where do we go to from here and whatnot, and I think, of course, nobody has the answers to that right now, but you'd still at least want to know what you do next.
Yeah, and I think this is where F1's really got to answer something. I mean, if you look at it from McLaren's point of view, they've travelled across the world. That's the other side of the world from the UK. They've travelled all that way. They've taken all that team personnel, etc. That's a huge expense to that team, and there's far less well-off teams that have done the same trip. They've done that on the advice of Formula One. Formula One has said, yep, we'll be racing, it'll be safe, and they've got there, and then a staff member's been put into this dangerous situation. And it has huge ramifications because that's got to be a 14-day period of isolation. We know that within 7 days of Australia was meant to be the Bahrain Grand Prix. Now that was meant to be behind closed doors, but can McLaren take part? That's a question that we're not going to know yet, because obviously other team members may well have been interacting with the staff member who contracted it. So there's so many questions from that, and it's Formula One has put people into that situation. And again, it's easy to sit here and say that after the fact, but I think it was very, very clear last week the way the wind was blowing worldwide on this. I know that in the last couple of days it's really escalated with the NBA. We had La Liga today. We had the Dutch League as well.
UEFA are going to meet, of course, next
Euro
week
2020
via video conference as well. That just goes to show you the I guess, epic proportions that this really has come to now.
Yeah, absolutely. And Euro 2020 might be Euro 2021, as we know. So that escalated over the past few days. So you could give F1 the benefit of the doubt that last week it didn't look as bad as that. But I think that they gambled in a big way on this race going ahead, and going ahead in a safe way. And I just don't think it's a very, very good look for a championship that ultimately has a lot of stakeholders in it, has a lot of participants in it, and has lots of fans going to every race. It's really hard. It just leaves you with a sour taste in your mouth a little bit that they went ahead with it, and then when it was clear that McLaren weren't going to be there were hours after where it seems like going ahead with the race was still seriously considered.
Exactly. Which is very ridiculous to think.
I sat in the office with McLaren withdrawing and us doing this now, and about 6 different championships have been called off in that time, and they've made snap decisions on that. And F1, there was absolutely nothing from them. So, really just not a good day for anyone involved in their comms team. The FIA as well just hasn't done anything. Just a real shame, because obviously F1's a great championship to follow. But when stuff like this happens, you just wonder who's running it, and it doesn't look like it's very competent people who are running it.
And then, of course, just thinking, in terms of you speaking, as I know you've had to this entire day, you've been glued, of course, to your laptop and your computer, just speaking to other journos and other people involved that are close to the situation there, including Lawrence, because I'm sure you've definitely spoken to him. Have you gotten a feel of what it's like there just on the ground now in Australia? Yeah,
so it's a shame Lawrence couldn't join us for this podcast, but
we'll get to him, though, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, from everything you can hear, is a lot of anxiety and confusion at the start of the week has very quickly turned into anger that this was allowed to happen like this. And I think as I've mentioned a couple of times now, the way it was communicated was very, very bad as well. But I think that there's definitely a huge degree of anger at this. And, again, people in hindsight, it's easy to say that the wrong decision was made, but you can make the wrong decision, and then once you know it's the wrong decision, make a series of correct calls. And F1 hasn't done that. It's persevered in this way, and that's the impression I'm getting from people out there. I mean, people were still up at 4 a.m, not sure if Friday practice was going to go ahead, and that's team members who have alarms set. That's journalists who are operating already probably jet lagged and operating on very, very minimal sleep, which is not ideal if you're trying to avoid getting a virus as well. That's not exactly the conditions you want your human body to be if you're trying to avoid getting sick. So all those little things like that, it's been handled so badly, and I think that is really reflected in everything I've heard from the guys out there.
Thanks for watching ESPN on YouTube, and for more sports highlights and analysis, be sure to download the ESPN app, and for premium content plus live streaming, make sure to subscribe to ESPN Player.